4. "Does this freighter have a name?" asked Villa idly, as he watched the monitors in front of his position. Avon looked up from the charts he was studying. "I imagine it must have. Why, do you wish to have a naming ceremony?" "No, it's just that we are being hailed by a non-Federation cruiser, and before I answer, I'd like to know who I should say we are." "We are the space freighter Revenge." "Revenge? Against whom?" "Against Servalan, against the President, against Travis, against the whole Federation, against Blake. Final, ultimate revenge that will never be forgotten." Villa stared at Avon in total disbelief. "Against Blake?" he said. "Revenge against Blake?" Corral took time to shower, sleep, and generally relax before setting into motion the next development of the situation on board the freighter. At some stage, she knew, she was going to have to try to talk with Avon again. In the prison, she had had it all too easy. Avon had seemed convinced that something outside his knowledge was influencing events, and he was prepared to wait to find out what it was. He was also intelligent enough to know that escapes made in the face of ignorance stood less than 1/10 of the chance of success of escapes effected on the basis of knowledge. Now things had changed. Avon felt he knew more about what was going on. Clearly, he believed, despite Orak's protestations, that machine-induced neural deviance existed in some form or other, and it was that belief that was driving him. But what else did he know? And more importantly, what did he think he knew? Corell herself did, of course, know much more about Avon than possibly any other person in the galaxy. Or, she told herself wryly, she thought she did. But Avon's overriding ability not to communicate, and worst still, his ability to communicate irrelevant and misleading bits of information, was something she had not fully bargained for when she had first adopted the role of Avon's jailer. What in the universe could possess someone as firmly based in his own personal reality as Avon to start believing in a vague half-legend like Mind? She put on the flaming scarlet uniform of some unidentified non-Federation planet and buttoned it up to the neck. Her white boots came up to her calves. Dressed, she marched back into the control room. "Where are we going?" she asked, taking her seat. Villa looked up. He had become so used to Avon taking off across the galaxy without a word of explanation that he was mildly surprised that anyone should even bother to ask. Avon did not look up. Unlike Corell, he had not taken time off to rest, but had instead dedicated himself to continuing the work with Revenge's navigational computers, studying charts, asking occasional questions, and watching intently as data was presented onto the monitor in front of the captain's position, which he had taken as his own. Finding herself ignored, Corell repeated the question. "Don't you know?" came the sarcastic reply. "I thought data prediction was your speciality." Corell smiled a smile that would have had Villa grovelling at her feet if there had been room enough in between her chair and the control panels. "Then let's say," she replied, "that I am just testing out a theory." Avon stood up and stretched his back. He had found himself a plain all-black outfit which, as with Corell's clothes, contained no frills, nothing to reveal to an outsider who or what he was, in marked contrast to Servalan. There was dirt on one sleeve gathered during part of his work inside a microscopic cubbyhole, where the quark links on the computer systems controlling the Revenge were situated. He hadn't bothered to change since. "You tell me your theory, and I'll give you marks out of 10 for guesswork." "Not for guesswork, Avon. Remember, I knew Anna's apartment number." "One success does not make you a genius at prediction, nor does it make you a welcome guest on this ship." "I may not be welcome, Avon, but I am essential, as you will see." "Why don't you prove it to me?" "We're going to scat." Very good, admitted Avon. And will you tell your audience how you worked that out? Or even better, suggested Villa, tell me where and what scat is. Carell turned to Villa to answer his question first. Scat is a low-gravity isolated planet circling the star of the same name in the 5th sector, rich in Signum. This ship is lacking in 2 things, shielding against plasma bolts and teleport. When we can be hit at any time by any moderately well-armed Federation ship, teleport would seem a luxurious extravagance. But Aurak told us that we needed to go to Ferron in the 3rd sector, which is exactly where Servalan would expect us to go. So, instead of going to Ferron and using your talents to steal the Signum, we go to Scat. The thought struck Villa that the change of plan could just mean he would avoid risking his neck in another madcap theft on behalf of Avon. I presume that Scat contains the stuff we need in abundance. I mean, we're not going to walk into several thousand of the President's troops or anything like that. A broad grin crossed Avon's face, and he moved across and put his arm around Villa's shoulders. Villa, I promise you that on Scat there are no guards and Signum is laying about on the ground, free for anyone to take. Good, I think, said Villa. He frowned and looked at Carell for help, but found none. So, what's the catch? I mean, if the stuff is there and it's valuable enough for us to travel across the galaxy without plasma protection, why doesn't everyone go after it? That is something we have to find out when we get there. And we can't ask Aurak because Servalan has Aurak. Villa, said Avon, walking back to his position and retaining his smile, your grasp on contemporary events is improving. In a few 100 years you'll be up to the level of dunce. And with that he returned to his analysis. Carell kept a closer eye on Villa than Avon seemed inclined to. Since takeoff, Villa had been deeply involved in his 3 boxes. The contents of the largest had been predictable: alcohol, adrenaline, soma, and parahyrene, a thick black drink that removed reality in seconds and replaced it with a set of alternatives that could be wonderful or tragic, depending upon the recipient's mood. It was rare, not because it was difficult to synthesize, nor because the base ingredients were hard to obtain, but because it was neither habit-forming nor addictive. As such, it had no use for Federation commissioners like Servalan. But if the first box contained what Carell had anticipated, the other 2 had taken her by surprise. One contained a tiny computer, whilst the other was made up of medical supplies. She was willing to accept that Villa had happened upon the supplies and brought them back expecting Avon's schemes to end up in damage to Villa, but knowing that however good a thief he was certainly not a computer expert. Carell passed several minutes watching Villa's actions with the boxes. Eventually, she worked out what he was up to, smiled, and simultaneously rebuked herself for taking quite so long to see the obvious. With that solved, she turned away and put her mind back to Avon and the problem of Scat. The approach to Scat proved uneventful. Avon worked with the computers and charts, Carell worked on her logical analyses, and Villa played with his boxes. Never known as one to indulge in much future planning, Villa had learned over the years that interstellar travel could be infinitely tedious, even with time-distort facility in an Avon-modified craft. At best, nothing would happen. At worst, they would meet aliens, Federation troops, Servalan. To Villa, the boxes were his insurance. During his days on Earth, insurance had been an inward among the thieves with whom he associated. You had insurance against the door you were opening exploding in your face. You used a young apprentice to prime the final sequence. You had insurance against getting caught. You put away enough credits to bribe the first-line official who would draw up the charges. You even had insurance against being deported to Cygnus Alpha. But Villa had never been much good at setting up insurance. That was why he had been such a good thief. He had done it all himself, Not through bravery, but through a genuine interest in solving the problems he found himself up against. He liked his work. Now, however, he had turned to insurance. The medical kit was insurance. So was the para-hyrene. Dangerous stuff, but sometimes any reality was better than the nightmare worlds Avon took them to. And the little computer was insurance. When he had first found it on Gouda Prime, Villa had had no idea what it was. The box was little more than 6 inches square, and most of the top surface was taken up with a brown, slightly sunken contact point. The rest of the top surface contained a speaker box, and nothing more. There were no controls, no dials, no touch contacts, just a series of green and red stripes. Fascinated, and with time to pass on the planet whilst the androids did their work, Villa had touched the box, spoken to it, prodded it, and finally, bored, tried to open it. Turning to his hip flask, he had then taken a sip of blue wine, but at that very moment an android had sneaked up behind him and announced its presence. Villa had jumped and spilt some of the precious liquid on the box. Auriga wine, dated 117 or 118 from Mu Eta. Rating -3. It was a voice from the box. Villa was so surprised he not only dropped it, but also dropped his flask. More wine fell onto the box. Auriga wine, dated 117 or 118 from Mu Eta. Rating -4. Villa objected. He had a feeling his taste was being criticised. It was -3 a second ago, he said. Sir, there's a limit to how much Auriga I can take, came the reply. The voice was deep, with a well-rounded quality which combined a mischievous humour with a degree of pride. What are you? Asked Villa. Kinesthetic analysis and transmission, sir. Eh? Long words could have the effect of reducing Villa to the shortest syllables he knew. The voice repeated itself, and then added helpfully, Cat, sir, if you prefer. There was a pause as Villa looked at the little machine uncertainly. Cat tried to help out. Sir, if you have anything which requires analysis, I can perform that humble task. The words were spoken in a slow, drawn-out way that gave the effect of powerful reserves of knowledge and seemed to add to the little machine's status. That's what you just did with the wine. Wine? Wine? Cat seemed affronted. Quark oil, sir. Do not demean the name of that holiest of liquids. No wine was ever produced from that mud heap called Auriga. Now, sir, if you would care to try some real wine... Villa was all attention and edged closer. But no, after that vile liquid, what would you taste? No, my friend, no. Your taste buds are doomed forever. For you, sir, life ahead must revolve around cell acid and sluice mud. No, Villa protested. You misunderstand. This is the first time I've had this wine. I can still taste the better things of life. I know a good wine. Such as? With just 2 words, Cat managed to make a dramatic point, using the sounds where a human might have gestured with arms and hands. The second word rose, adding to the withering criticism Cat seemed to find necessary to pour upon any being found in possession of an inferior intoxicant. Villa was suitably nonplussed. He hesitated, started speaking, stopped, was about to take a drink from the flask, thought better of it, and tried to concentrate. Nerfak. What? Cat seemed disinclined to believe what it had heard. Nerfak, Villa repeated, sticking to his point. Nerfak mead. Well, what year? 130, 140. They were all good around then. A change came over the little machine's deep voice. Sir, I see now you are a man of taste and discernment forced temporarily on hard times. If I can be of any assistance. Villa looked at Kat, and a broad grin passed over his face. "Can you seek out substances?" he asked. "Liquid, solid, gas. Sir, whatever you require, I can tell you its nearest location." "Fine, fine." Villa looked around, almost afraid that he would suddenly be discovered and Kat taken from him. "Just find me the best wines on this base." And Kat had done just that, leading Villa into storage areas, picking up not only wine but also adrenaline, soma, and inevitably, since it was to be found on Gouda Prime, parahyrene. On Revenge, Villa delighted in giving tiny drops of varying substances of quality to his newfound companion. One unlooked-for facet of Kat turned out to be its abilities to offer subtle advice on the delicate question of the making of cocktails. It kept Villa happy for every hour he was off duty, and gave him something to look forward to during the boring hours in the control room. Scat, from 2000 Spatials, looked unimpressive. There were no signs of civilization, no pools of deadly radiation, little foliage, a spot of wildlife in the oceans, and that was about it. Only the highly sophisticated satellite in geostationary orbit, at just over 15,000 Spatials, struck an ambiguous note. The master computer on board Revenge took the ship towards the object as slowly as the crude controls on board the ship would allow. Corel, returning to the bridge as fresh as ever, found the need to reveal another of her talents. "You need to go in on manual," she said. "Very true," Avon told her. "But I am not a pilot, unless perhaps you are suggesting Villa." "Come back, Tarrant, all is forgiven," said Villa irreverently. "He may well do that," Avon told him mysteriously. "But in the meantime, we do not have anyone among our crew of 3 who has spent the 6 years at Federation Academy, which is the normal prerequisite for this sort of work." "Let me try," said Corel. "Don't tell me," said Villa. "In addition to 5 years spent training in logical psychology and sociology, plus 3 years at the Institute of Human Technology and Behavioral Control, you also trained as a pilot in your spare time." Corel said nothing. "Not talking any more?" asked Villa. "You told me not to tell you." Corel moved to the pilot's position. "Disengage the flight computer, Avon," she said calmly. Reality once more tormented Villa. He started to plead the case of the navigational instrumentation. For the briefest moment, Avon looked uncertain. Everything about the girl had been a surprise so far. Why not an unrevealed ability to fly a space freighter? He needed help. The memory banks of Revenge lacked anything that could remotely be called up-to-date knowledge of the star system. And without that, the computers would do little more than assume all was normal. He shrugged and pressed 2 contacts. "The ship is yours," he told Corel. "If we are going to crash, let me know first. I might just have time to hand back to the flight computer." "And after you've told Avon," said Villa, "tell me too. I might just have time to get drunk." Corel nursed the primitive controls in the same calm and gentle way that she undertook every task. A slight smile played across her face. Once she passed a hand through her long fair hair, pushing it back. Once she coughed slightly, and even found time to cover her mouth with both hands and apologize to the rest of the crew. Villa, his face drenched in sweat, heard neither the cough nor the comment. Cautiously, the old ship made its way to the orbiting satellite. As they approached, Avon kept all short-range scanners on the subject, whilst Villa watched the long-range monitors for any sign of hostile action. Both men reported blanks. At one spatial, Corel brought the ship into a position where it was motionless in relation to the satellite. Avon turned to the ship's ID log, matching the view through the scanners with everything in the memory disks. "It's old," she said after a few moments' concentration. "Very old. About 500 years. and no sign of functioning. According to the log, it was used as a sort of unmanned communications device, beaming information received from one part of the surface to other locations. Before the Tariel cell came along with its instant communication, this type of thing was quite common, Carell added. Historian too, commented Villa, moving out of his seat and taking a drink from a supply he had stashed under the rear-view screen placed behind the 3 controllers' positions. He didn't even bother to ask Kat's advice, but drank straight from the bottle. Carell ignored his taunt. Villa put the bottle down, resumed his seat, and put his feet up on the controls. "Shall we shoot it down, just in case?" he asked. "Don't you think that might be a little premature?" asked Carell, as always taking every comment seriously. "For all we know, there might be some remnants of that civilization down there, and the sudden shooting down of that last artifact of their past might be considered a little hostile." Avon returned to more practical matters. "Do you want to pilot this thing down, or shall we make a dramatic breakthrough in the use of pure logic as a controlling force?" he asked sternly. "With the computers, you'll probably get down safely, but will follow the most obvious path, which any scat instrumentation that exists will predict. With me, you'll also get down predictably, but with a less obvious course. We might even get up as well." Carell's descent started off as well as she predicted, with a few bumps through the atmosphere. As the surface rushed towards them, Avon kept close watch on the screens for any sign of electronic activity that would give away the presence of civilization. A society civilized enough to attack revenge with something more than rocks, arrows, and boiling oil. He found nothing, and neither did the ship's computers. Indeed, all data screens were still registering blank when the attack began. Villa spotted it first on the rear monitors, an array of plasma bolts aiming straight at them from behind. "Put up the shields!" shouted Avon as Villa announced the news. "That's the whole point," called back Villa. "They aren't showing on the main screens, only on the rear screens." "Put up the shields!" "That's still no good. Even if the computers could see them, we couldn't do anything. We can't stand plasma attacks. That's why we're here, remember?" "Then check for computer malfunction, Villa. Unless you propose to defend the ship by the force of your argument that we are irreparably doomed." Villa performed the checks rapidly. The computers checked out normal, he told Avon. "Then put up the shields anyway. They may not be using plasma bolts, Villa. They may just look like them. There's nothing to lose by putting up the shields. Carell, change course, get us up, and on the far side of that satellite." Carell worked hard at the controls. As the ship picked up speed, the roar of the fusion engines could be heard on the flight deck. "I thought this place was uninhabited," she called above the din. "And I thought you were designing a course that computers couldn't predict," called back Avon. "Bolt still running?" shouted Villa, petrified. "Sir." A new voice entered the control room. It was calm and clear, lacking in the urgency of the speech of Villa, Avon, and Carell, but nonetheless it was a sound that demanded attention. It was a voice that found no need of shouting, even with the ramjets operating at full pressure. Only Avon kept his attention on the job at hand. Despite herself, Carell looked at Villa, and Villa looked at the source of the word. "Sir, may I have a little drink to steady the nerves? A little beta Procyon 99, perhaps? The merest drop would suffice." Villa looked at Kat in amazement. Of all the times to ask. And yet, the beta Procyon 99 did have a certain soothing tendency. Perhaps a little drop. "Have you got those screens up?" It was Avon who brought Villa back to the present. "Yes, but they're draining power." "Keep them up. Carell, are we gaining on them?" "No, yes." "Make up your mind." "That is difficult when most of the ship believes they are not there at all. Those things only exist on one set of screens, and the computers deny any existence of them at all. But for what it's worth, their distance remains the same. When Villa called, they appeared to be at 1200 spatials. They're still at 1200 spatials. Avon decided to act rapidly. Villa, take the shields down, divert the power back to the main drives. Let's try and outrun them. Shields down? They're gaining on us. They're almost on top. Sir, about that drink. There is a container of beta-procyon 99 in the recess 18 inches behind your position. Perhaps now might be the time to consider. A sudden vibration shook the ship, and the 3 crew members found themselves hard pushed to stay in their seats. Avon was the first to pull himself back to his position. Damage report. Villa checked. None. None? There must be. We were hit. No, we felt like we were hit, corrected Carell. But we weren't. What are those bolts? Gone. They must have exploded all around us. But they couldn't have. There's no way they could have made up 1200 spatials in 5 seconds. Unless they were waiting for the shields to go down. But then why miss us? If they have that sort of technology, plus the ability to make up a 1200 deficit when we were moving at time distort 8, they are certainly going to have the capability to hit us. Are we clear? The question came from Kat. Carell checked. We are, and we're on the opposite side of the planet from the satellite, except, said Villa, checking his controls, the satellite is sitting right on our doorstep. Then we are on the wrong side, suggested Avon caustically. Carell stayed calm. Right side, right position. There are now 2 satellites where there was only 1 before. Avon pounded his fists. Let's go right out of this system. 10,000 spatials and then dead stop. At dead stop, they sat in silence. After 5 minutes, Villa went to get the drink that both he and Kat fancied. After an hour, he went to get some food. When he returned, he found Carell and Avon still at their positions. You must have worked out where the next source of signum is by now, he said, as he took up his place once more. It is 3 sectors away, and we are not going there, Avon told him simply. So, where are we going? Scat, said Avon, jabbing a finger at the speck of light on the screen. Even you can't be that crazy, said Villa. We've got no plasma protection. Now, I know you don't hold my intellect in the highest regard, but I would say that the bunch of people, or whatever they are down there, is probably quite used to strange spacecraft coming in to raid their backwater planet for mineral resources. And quite probably by now, they have worked out that the people who raid all have one thing in common, a lack of plasma protection. So they fire plasma bolts. Villa, your powers of logical deduction are superb, said Carell. Villa grinned broadly. Except for one thing. The smile vanished as Villa asked uncertainly what it was. They missed. All that technology, and they missed. Yes, I did notice that too, Villa told her. I also noticed that I am still alive to argue with Avon. Don't tell me you'll support this idea of going back. It seems logical to me. Logical? That's the craziest form of logic I ever heard. You arrive in an unprotected armed ship, you get shot at, and then you go back for more? This time, Avon explained, we make it harder for them. We go in without power. Carell, as the pilot who would have to take them in, seemed unmoved, but Villa was nervous. How close? He asked. 1 spatial, Avon told him, his teeth gritted. At that distance we switch on and still have time to make a safe landing. We'll burn up, Villa said. Then you won't have to use the thermal control on your spacesuit too often, will you? Avon told him uncompromisingly. Spacesuit? Have you seen the spacesuits these ships carry? Primitive is not the word. Avon got up from his position. I should seriously consider putting on a suit if I were you, because if you don't, you're likely to asphyxiate. We're really turning all the power off. If the things on Scat can read our equipment so well that they can launch an attack at the very moment we turn the shield off, maybe they won't be too clever at spotting a ship burning up in the atmosphere without any power. Let's go. It'll be a belly flop, said Carell. Which means we'll be side on an alien planet with no chance of taking off again, Villa added. We'll worry about that later, said Avon. The order had been enough for Carell, and she was already climbing into the basic survival suits the ship carried. They were silvery white two-piece affairs, which offered a minimal amount of possibilities for any movement other than operating the controls. Even walking back across the cabin seemed a mammoth task. Designed only for the direst emergencies, such as depressurization of the entire ship, they were built so that the wearer could sit tight for days. Maneuvering the ship was protected from the cascades of flying debris that accompanied every accident in space. The designs had been superseded 30 years before, but the Federation had never shown the highest regard for the comfort of its freighter crews. Getting the cargo into port in one piece, on the other hand, was always given alpha priority, and that is exactly what the suits allowed. Climbing into his own suit, Villa knew that once again he had lost. What dismayed him most, though, was the apparent support given by Carell. He had been counting on her to act as a restraint upon Avon. Now it seemed he would be permanently outvoted. As soon as they were all seated, Carell tilted the ship gently towards the planet, gave it the slightest nudge with the auxiliary boosters, and let Revenge, now apparently little more than a dead dark hulk, move towards Scat for the second time. On their slow journey, edged on only by the force of Scat's weak gravity and occasional minimal bursts of fusion power, the three sat in darkness. Only the screens were online, enabling the crew to watch the planet for any possible signs of attack. It was an hour before they spotted the satellite, and 2 hours before they passed it. 10 minutes later, they started to encounter the atmosphere. With no stabilizers to help them, the ship started to be knocked around. At the same time, it started to pick up heat. Villa was the first, and in fact only member of the crew, to complain. He complained of the heat, the vibration, of feelings of sickness, of gravity drag, of deorientation, blindness, he had his eyes closed, and a variety of diseases he invented for the occasion. He stopped complaining at 12 spatials as Avon caught sight of the bolts. "Damn them," he shouted. "Carell, let's move." In what seemed to be one move, Carell returned power to the ship and began the rapid rise back out through the atmosphere. "The bolts are gaining on us," called Villa. "Keep the screens down until they are right there. We need to try and outrun them." "Still gaining," called Villa. 5, 4, 3 screens, replied Avon. But his voice was drowned by the noises generated by the vibrations that accompanied the attack and the ramjet howl as Carell took the ship through its paces. Villa's comment that whatever it was on Scat was trying to vibrate the crew of Revenge to death was ignored. The request by Cat for a drop of adrenaline and soma had a more dramatic effect. Avon turned on the small box with eyes filled with malice. Only the continuing vibration stopped him making it to the analyzer. But then suddenly, all was quiet. The screens were clear. Revenge was once more alone. Avon moved straight to Cat. He picked it up, turned it over, and took it across to the main computer, placing it on a plate to the right of the master machine. "Analysis printout," he ordered. The printout came up on the screen at Avon's position. He studied it carefully, but eradicated the printout before Carell had a chance to look across. Villa felt the attention his machine was being given was unnecessary. He spoke rapidly, changing the subject. "That's 2 attempts on Scat. Is that enough?" "It's enough for me. What about you, Carell? How do you feel? Ready to leave? Time to visit the 8th sector, other side of the galaxy. No Federation-inhabited planets. In fact, no planets." They missed twice. "Be thankful. Maybe they're just bad shots." "As I said last time, not with that sort of sophistication." "So what do you want to do? Give them shooting lessons? Maybe we should offer ourselves as target practice." Carell tried to broaden the discussion. Villa, we can be quite certain that whatever they are firing at us is not plasma. The plasma wouldn't have given us the sort of jolts that we suffered each time. If it is something else, the chances are that our screens will be able to stand the attack. And since we know we can't outrun their bolts, whatever they are, we might as well use the screens once the attack starts. The power they take isn't much use to us in any other way. Okay, I give in. Avon gets to everyone like this. You should have dealt with him when you had him in prison. You let him talk to you. Now he has your brain twisted. It's a disease, and contact with Avon means you get it. Except you didn't, said Avon. Presumably because it only affects brains. Villa gave up. Come on, let's go down there and land. If they miss again, we can step outside the ship and wave a flag so they can go taking pot shots. There's just one thing I ask. What's that? Said Carell with a smile. You watch the screens. I'll keep my eyes closed. You were doing that anyway, said Avon. Despite his protestations, Villa watched intently this time, and when the attack came shortly after they passed the satellite on their third run-in, he was the first to shout. The third attack was a replica of the previous two. Only this time Revenge kept going. At 15 spatials, the scat ships fired. But there was no bang, no vibration. 5 bolts were launched, and they ran and stayed at 15 spatials. Villa reported. Avon watched the controls. Carell flew the ship. Take us down, Avon said. There was a slight bump. I just have, said Carell. The ground had approached Villa faster than he would have liked. At one moment the whole ship had seemed to be surrounded by bolts, flare attacks, space liquids, and several other forms of death, disease and destruction that he had not even heard of. Even with the expertly soft landing of Carell, Villa felt decidedly sick. Nothing disastrous happened. Carell stayed at the controls, cool, calm, smiling, looking beautiful. In between feeling he was about to throw up, Villa wondered how she did it. After a few moments he realized they were down. Avon put the outside view on everyone's screen. They had landed in what appeared to be a vast green park. Behind them, deep tracks dug into the rich grassland where they had slithered to a halt. The neatly mown lawn continued away from them in all directions, broken only by a crazed blaze of colour about half a mile away, so bizarre in appearance that it was impossible to take in at one glance. There was a blue brick wall, crumbling, cracked, twisted. It stretched from horizon to horizon, at times reaching up into the misty sky, at times falling to the ground, but never quite disappearing into the grass. Sometimes it was solid, and in other places huge holes appeared through which could be seen flashing lights, waving tentacles, peering eyes, distant suns, spreading oceans. At the approaches to the wall, the grasslands gave way to something more than grass. Shrubs and bushes rose up and became more animal-like than plant-like. It was as if the grass was throwing up mutations of itself in an attempt to deal with the wall, as if in its pure form it could not face the wall. As the crew of Revenge looked, the patterns seemed to change, not just behind and in front of the wall, but in the very wall itself. Parts which had been tall were reduced to rubble. Rubble rose and reached the sky, holes disappeared and reformed somewhere else. And all the time in the background there was a murmuring. The sound of all this endless, inexplicable activity was no more than a handful of decibels above silence. Avon tore his eyes away from the screen and touched controls. They all registered a lack of animal life. In fact, they registered nothing more than grass. The computers still showed 0 readings for electromagnetic activity, sentient life activity, in fact, all activity. Back on the screens, deep lakes had formed in front of the wall, and huge lizard-like creatures appeared, only to walk towards the wall and vanish into the ever-changing structure. The air is clean, said Carell. I find it hard to believe, Villa told her, but she was not going to be deterred from making her report. Less than 0.61 gravity, and nothing to worry about. No nasty radiation, healthy sunlight, warm temperature. The grass does not appear to be covered in a plague or virus of any kind, and there seem to be few wild animals. All in all, it is safe. This is insane, said Villa. Just look out there. I tell you what my instruments say. Then either the screens or the instruments are lying, said Avon, rising. And the only way to find out is to go outside and take a look. Unless our eyes are going to play tricks on us too. Get your suit off, get your walking boots on, and get outside. Or would you like to stay inside the ship, on your own, on watch? Villa's natural inclination was to stay in the ship. On the other hand, he knew that if the past were anything to go by, contact with Avon and Carell could easily be broken, and he would find himself sitting in a vehicle he couldn't fly, watching a wall that broke all the laws of science. At least if he joined the others outside, he would not be alone. But on the other hand, he would be closer to the wall. He asked if it was safe. He protested about his badly damaged right leg, injured in some now forgotten previous adventure. He complained about the headaches he was getting, but he refused to take up the option of isolation inside Revenge. Just as everyone was ready to move, Avon did the unexpected. He picked up Cat and held it in his hands for a moment. He turned the box over several times before finally putting it down on the contact pad set in front of the computer. Nothing happened, except that Avon grinned, put the box in his pocket, and turned to the door. Villa felt moved to protest that Cat was his. He had found the little machine he claimed, which gave him the right of ownership. What gave Avon his special interest in it now, he wanted to know. Without speaking, Avon took the box out of his pocket and threw it across to Villa. "Okay, you carry it," he said, and started towards the ladders that led to the main airlock. Looking grim, Villa took the machine between his thumb and forefinger, holding it tight, turning to follow Avon. But before he could move, there was a bang, a hiss, and a flash of lights on every control panel in the control room. "It's the main entry lock," said Carell. "Opening." Even now her voice lacked alarm. It was calm, clear, as if she were announcing to friends that dinner was ready. It made Villa nervous having someone that cool next to him. Avon touched several controls, flicking through a variety of positions on the monitors until he picked up a figure making his way along the final short corridor towards the control room. As Avon spotted him, the figure reached the entry hatch for the main deck. The door slid to one side and revealed a short, fragile, darkly tanned young man with wild white hair wearing a plain white smock over plain white trousers. His face seemed locked into an awkward grin. His ears stuck out more than they should. His nose was a little too long for his face. His hands held at strange angles. With no weapon to pull, Avon sat back in his chair, giving out an air of nonchalance that Villa, for one, certainly did not feel. Everyone waited for the uninvited guest to speak, but he didn't. He grinned, opened and closed his mouth, and regularly changed his weight from one foot to another. Eventually, it was Villa who broke the silence, with the not wholly original question, "Who are you?" If the creature before them heard, he gave no sign of acknowledgement. He continued to stand, shifting his weight. Villa repeated the question. Carell stood up. The stranger seemed surprised and rapidly moved backwards. Before Carell had fully risen, he was out into the corridor and pushing his way down the steps into the main airlock and out onto the planet's surface. "Presumably," said Carell, "we should follow." She raised her eyebrows and pursed her lips, waiting for Avon's opinion. "Why not?" said Avon. "He's heading for the wall. Villa, give me Cat." Villa looked down and found he was gripping the box tighter than ever. He was too shaken by the experience of the stranger to complain. He handed it over and finally found his voice. "I suppose neither of you has thought that this might be a trap?" "We've got to leave the ship to get to the crystals. We don't know where the crystals are, but I can tell you there is no record of them being found under lawns of well-mown grass. So we have to go somewhere." "No, we never thought of that, Villa," said the thief to himself. "What an idea! Who'd ever want to spring a trap on us on an unknown, uncharted planet?" He was still talking as he stepped onto the grass and gave himself an even bigger shock than he had had so far. The air was fresh, but then that was what the instrumentation had said. The grass felt like grass, but no one had suggested otherwise. The problem was that the wall had gone. In its place was a perfectly stable, normal, if rather huge, building. The white stranger was nowhere to be seen. Each of the three carried a bag, but only Villa's was full. It was his toolkit. And he spent much of the walk across the grass reminding the other two of the unequalness of the distribution, alternating this only with comments on the foolishness of staying on the planet at all. Carell did point out the obvious once, that their bags were for Signum and would later be heavier than Villa's kit, but it had no effect. Villa was in complaining mood, and no one was going to stop him. By and large, no one tried. As they approached the building, it became clear that it was an edifice on an enormous scale. Not only was it imposing in terms of height and width, but it had a depth which the crew of Revenge had not appreciated from their ground position. Lacking any other landmark, they headed for the lofty pillars that marked out one of many entrances around the building into which the stranger could have disappeared. As they approached, they saw a number of points where broad stone steps came out of the grass, leading up to a wide walkway made of the same grey stone. It gave the place the air of a museum, with recesses set into the towering walls. As the trio approached, it became clear that there were two types of break in the building. At regular intervals, there were what could have been doorways, 20 feet high and 6 feet wide. Between them, more irregularly spaced, were lighter regions, where it almost seemed as if something had been set into the stone, something that was more than just a change in texture or colour, something that might once have been alive. "About 10 miles long at a rough estimate," said Carell to no one in particular. "And a couple of miles wide," added Villa, glad to have something to talk about. He was plagued by a nasty feeling that at any second the ever-changing wall would return, the grass would become carnivorous, and he would be buried under a hail of bricks. So what do you need to keep in a building with that sort of area? And why surround it by mile after mile of grass? He sat down, only to instantly remember his past fears. He shot to his feet and checked his backside for teeth marks. Avon turned to Carell. "What made you land here? Why choose this spot?" "Not chosen so much as given. This is where we ended up. That buffeting took the ship all over the place. I redefined my job as keeping Revenge the right way up and in one piece." "So, this is the place we are supposed to be," said Avon. "There's a door, Villa." There was no sign of how the thing opened, but Villa, back on his home territory mentally if not physically, got to work in as business-like way as possible, listening, watching gauges on the long tube that he placed against the door, first vertical, then horizontal, and finally at 45 degrees. He next attached 3 microprobes to the door and stood back. After a moment waiting, with no developments that would have had any significance to a non-thief, he packed everything back into his box. Turning, he found Carell and Avon sitting on the stone steps, looking back over the grassland towards their ship, now tiny, but reassuringly still there in the far distance. Determined to prove his value to Carell, he turned back to the door. Careful not to make the slightest sound, he gave it the most gentle push he could contrive. Despite its enormous apparent weight, the door gave immediately. It wasn't, he recalled later, as if it swung open. It was rather as if it gave way, as if it simply ceased to exist. Villa's desperate shout had Avon and Carell on their feet within a second, but by the time they reached the opening, Villa had gone. The door remained ajar. Inside there appeared to be no inside at all. All that could be seen was the same grassland they had just crossed. The same, except for one thing. On the grasslands that appeared to be inside the building, there was no revenge. There was also no Villa. Carell was the first to react visibly to the situation. "Give me your hand, Avon," she demanded. Avon did not respond. Carell looked at him intently. "Are you going to leave him in there? Wherever there is?" Avon looked from Carell to the door and back again. "Well now," he said, "it's a tempting possibility. Avon, I know about your dedicated self-interest. I also know that you value Villa as a thief able to do something you can't. So don't tell me that you don't want to rescue him." To the outsider, it would have appeared at that moment as if Avon was carefully considering Carell's point of view. In fact, he was considering her knack for expounding views which most people could only put forward when in some sort of self-justifying rage. There was a bitterness implied in what she said, but it didn't show. Avon noted it as a clever trick, an important element in the lady's armoury. "All right," he said, "but don't complain to me about the results. This is your idea." Carell did not seek to argue. Instead, she held out a hand and instructed Avon to pull her backwards as she touched the door. Getting the best footing he could on the stone floor, Avon did as he was asked, whilst Carell gingerly prodded the door with one finger. Without a sound, the opening seemed to move away from them, and a great force pulled both Avon and Carell into the yawning gap. As Carell slipped further through the opening, Avon let go, a faint smile playing on his lips as he watched her vanish. On the far side of the still open door, the grass remained, but Carell was not on it. There was, in fact, nothing but grass. Carefully, Avon moved back from the door, across the stone floor, and down the wide entrance steps to the grass. For the first time, he put his hands down and touched it, pulling gently. Several tufts came away quite easily. He walked back up the steps towards the now seemingly closed door, stopping by Villa's toolkit. From it, he removed an aluminium probe and pushed it against the door. Again he felt the section pulling him in, but the probe had left him far enough back to avoid being drawn through. The aluminium, he noted, also reduced the power somewhat. As door turned into opening, Avon threw the grass in. This time he was not pulled forward, but thrust backwards by the force. Picking himself up, Avon slowly made his way down the steps and started the long walk back to the ship.